Welcome back to the grim darkness of the far future, friends, as I once again dip my toe back into the world of Warhammer 40k. It's been a while, mostly because there's a lot of other stuff that I wanted to cover, but today we're going to kind of go unwisely cannonball into one of my favorite aspects of the 40k universe, and that is, of course, the warp. The warp is a topic that I really wanted to cover before getting into any more lore, because it's so foundational to understanding the setting, right? How events transpired, like mankind traveling amongst the stars, or understanding the corrupting power of chaos, psychic abilities, and so on. So, what is the warp? Well, it's also known as the immaterium. It's this dimension of pure psychic energy that just sits outside of the dimensions that we can typically interact with. Those being, left, right, up, down, forward, backward, and of course time. And when I say it's a dimension of psychic energy, that can be a little bit hard to grasp, but think about it like this. For every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. When we, as sentient life, feel strong emotions, good or bad, shared or not, whether you express it or not, it does go somewhere. That place is the warp, right? It's like putting out bad or good energy. Projecting energy and emotions of, say, hate and anger creates ripple effects on this plane of existence. We don't typically see it or interact with it, but it is still happening in the background. But the same is true for virtues like faith and kindness, right? The warp is not inherently evil necessarily, it just reflects back to us what we of all life have collectively put into the universe. It's just the worst mirror ever. And the reason that I point out all life specifically is that we as humans can feel the ramifications of energy put into the warp by other species. It's not like a one-to-one personal thing, and we'll cover why that's important in just a bit. While the specifics on the discovery of the warp and how we measured it and that kind of stuff is kind of vague, we do know that its discovery is what allowed for mankind to truly take to the stars in a meaningful way. Using a new technology called the warp drive, mankind essentially leaves our dimension, slips into the warp, then pops back out at a different location. Because the warp works differently in regards to time and space, this allows for the traversal of massive distances, frequently allowing a ship to travel several light years at a time. Now, one thing I love about this idea of 40k is how the warp is described, right? Simply put, they talk about it like it's an ocean or some body of water, complete with currents, storms, dangerous shoals, and more. When we slip into the warp, it's kind of like if you were to jump into a river on a raft. You just get taken with the current. That current can speed you up, slow you down. If there's a storm, it can wreck your day, but we'll talk about storms here in a sec. But then, of course, you can hop off the river and you're back to moving on normal land. Yet, you've traversed a greater distance than when you were just walking, right? You went faster than you could have otherwise. There are maps and studies that constantly monitor the ebb and flow of the warp, and any humans that are attuned to this realm, often called psychers, have the potential to be able to sense it. In fact, there's a whole subcategory of psychers called navigators, whose sole job is to, wait for it, help ships navigate the warp. One thing that helps them with this is the light of the Astronomicon. This is that big golden throne that the Emperor sits in that's very prominent in many pieces of artwork for 40k. Basically, imagine it like a giant lighthouse, so navigators can kind of get their bearings in the warp and use those bearings to avoid known dangerous obstacles. Again, I really can't express how much or how important it is that the way that it's articulated within the mankind, sphere is that it is talked about like it is a nautical thing. Now, I'll touch on psychic abilities in a dedicated video, but understand that it's their ability to sense and interact with the immaterium that gives them power. That's essentially what psychers are in the 41st millennium. So the warp allows for, superpowers and unparalleled travel amongst the galaxy, right? Thumbs up all around. Things are great. Everything's awesome. Well, no. The warp is rife with danger, and that's where we're going to transition into talking about the dangers. And for me personally, to kind of like keep my head, level, I've broken these up into two types, right? Practical dangers, and we'll call them demonic ones. I use these terms broadly, and you'll understand why. On the practical side, since the warp is kind of acting like an ocean or a river, it has a lot of danger associated with it. There are currents that can be too strong and pull ships far off course, or they just never come back. Warp storms, which can tear ships asunder with ease, not to mention that there are gulfs and deposits, sort of like how we have ship graveyards. As these graveyards get bigger, sometimes they're spit back into the material world, which we would call space hulks, where it's just ships that have been rammed and crashed together, just kind of get coughed up. Any kind of like danger that you could associate with 1700s nautical travel here on Earth is pretty much a very well documented thing in the 41st millennium, and the Black Library books go into some really cool examples of these things, like where there's known places where the warp spits up ships, and then pirate people will form kind of a civilization around that place so they can go raid the ships whenever they're coughed up. All kinds of cool things. And while I find the more practical stuff of traveling the warp very interesting, I really do like that. I can't stress enough. We need to switch to the stranger things, right? Let's go back to the idea we started with, that your emotions, when projected out, actually go somewhere and have an impact. If you have enough of that same emotion and it's poured into the warp, it can collect. And if enough of it collects, that energy can gain its own sentience. At first, it's this crude and unintelligent thing, but the more it grows, the more mindful of its own existence it becomes. What I'm describing here is the nature of chaos and how, as we know, it developed in the warp, right? Anger, rage, murder, bloodshed, and martial honor. These are some of the most basic emotions or actions that a life form can do. And over enough time and over enough, alien civilizations, because it's not just humans, all that energy went into forming Khorne, for example, the blood god. Fear of disease and death and the feeling of dread and hopelessness in its wake made Nurgle. The plots and schemes as well as dreams of mortals formed Tzeentch, and of course the hedonistic excess of the Eldar created Slaanesh. And that's why they're called the primordial, evils, right? They've always existed, because as long as life has existed, we've feared death. We have anger, we have plans and this kinds of thing. And so they really truly are like the most basic forms of life, but that's how they have gotten so big, is that they're everywhere. The things that create them and feed them are everywhere. Now, there are, of course, other entities in the warp. It's not just the big four and their minions, but these entities call the Immaterium their home. When we reach into the warp, we enter into their domain, and they're drawn to us like moths to a light. So the question becomes, how do ships survive dipping into a hell dimension, right? Well, mankind has kind of figured this out, where we've invented a device known as a Geller field. Every ship has one, and it's the most important thing aboard if you're going to be hopping through the warp. Think of it as a bubble or skin of reality that covers a ship, keeping the things that are of the warp out and things pretty tame inside. It's the shield that keeps the evil at bay. And there's a few stories of what happens when a Geller field fails, and none of them end well, right? Demons manifest aboard the ship. There can be rapid mutation, not just of you, but literally the ship as well will start to warp and twist and bend. It's all bad, it's all ugly, and it's all awesome. It's this power, when it seeps into reality, that warps and twists living things and gives us those super cool chaos units that exist in 40k, right? Demonic machines and mutated super soldiers, etc. And since they are mortal, they can take that, which is of the warp, and bring it into real space. And all of a sudden, the demonic, twisting nature of the Immaterium pours onto humanity's doorstep. So let's take a break here and talk about, why is the idea of the warp cool? I will definitely tell you, I think it is the most unique thing about Games Workshop's universes. By that I mean, it has, I don't know, there's parts of it that are, we'll say, inspired by other, intellectual properties, but there's just something about the way GW has done it that always made it feel so unique and so original. This idea that it's a psychic dimension where we're putting energy out and then it reflects back at us. Like, I love the fact that it's a mirror, but it's not a mirror of like a one-to-one, you're looking at yourself. It's a mirror to existence, right? Because you could have an Eldar put energy out there that helps Khorne, right? Meaning like they kill somebody and every little bit of anger and wrath feeds Khorne, but all of a sudden you have to deal with the consequences of that. So it's like all of existence being reflected, but when you look out there, of course that demon, he's coming for you specifically, and it's nasty. I also like the fact that it is a necessary evil. We need to have this warp travel to make society amongst the stars happen. And actually, with the Dark Imperium kind of theme that they've been doing, if you don't know, they've basically created a set of warp storms that have cut the galaxy in two. Meaning that there are basically some people who can see the Astronomicon and travel is much more safe there, but then on the dark side of everything, things are really rough. And if you have been paying attention at all to the campaign systems and that kind of thing released, you'll know that Vigilus is a planet that comes up a lot, and that's because it's kind of like a bridge between the two sides, so it's a very important place. And its importance relies on the fact that the warp is a crazy powerful presence in this setting. One thing that I also like is putting stuff in nautical terms. I know that I mentioned that a few times, but I can't stress enough how it makes things so much easier to understand, right? And I like that there's still this, like, you know, sci-fi fantasy explorer thing feeling vibe when it comes to like people striking out amongst the stars, and it's the big unknown and this mystery and how it ebbs and flows and behaves like water, but also has this more sinister undertone to it. The warp and the entities within it have formed so much of the 40K universe. By that I mean obviously space travel, which is the first one, and then as we interacted with it more, it really ramped up towards the Horus Heresy, which was one of the defining moments of the game's setting, where the forces of chaos in the warp started to corrupt the best of us, Space Marines. And so all of a sudden things fell apart, and now that we fast forward another 10,000 years, this setting that we now find ourselves in is just dominated by darkness, and it's all this evil just pouring out of these places. Yes, there are aliens and that kind of thing, and we're trying to survive amongst all of them, but all of us universally have to deal with the warp in one way or another, and some of us just understand it better than others. So it's an integral thing, and I kind of wanted to put this out there as just kind of a little primer, because as I'm going to start talking about factions and notable characters and that kind of stuff, I wanted to have this base, so when I mention that there's a twisting effect to the warp, you have some kind of grasp of it. So anyway, thank you all so much for watching and listening. I appreciate it. Go ahead, tell me down below, what is your favorite chaos thing in 40K? Could be a character, a battle, something like that. I'd love to hear about it. And I'll catch you in my next Warhammer 40K lore video. Thank you so much for listening. Happy wargaming. Hey everybody, I hope you enjoyed that video. It was made possible by the folks over here to the left. These are my top supporters over here on YouTube and on Patreon that keep this channel going. If you'd like to learn more about how to become a supporter and get some cool things in the process, like exclusive pictures and interactions with me, and get your questions answered here on the channel, go ahead and click any of the links down below or the join button on the community page over on YouTube. Regardless of your choice, I wanted to thank you so much for joining me with this video, and I look forward to seeing you in my next one. Happy wargaming.